I mean, difficult, challenging. We went out in canoes and the hunters were shooting, around us, and we would be looking out for birds that were injured and, drop into the water and go and rescue them. And I remember, us taking one duck onto the boat, and, it had blood coming out of its beak, and, it was just like a very, very sad experience.
As regular viewers of the show will know, we always like to start off these interviews by taking the time to learn about our guests and their journey to a more compassionate lifestyle and vegan philosophy. I understand that at 7 years old, your grandmother served up your first taste, as it were, of making the connection between meat and the animals that it comes from. We'd love to have you share the story, and also how a chance encounter with an animal liberation table in New South Wales inspired you to dedicate your whole life to helping animals.
Yeah, I love sharing this story. It takes me back to sitting around the dinner table with my grandmother. She lived with us and did most of the cooking in our house. And I was 7 years old. And her cultural heritage was Lithuanian. And tongue is a traditional Lithuanian or Eastern European dish. So I remember quite viscerally, digging into this piece of brown stuff and asking what it was. And when I heard it was tongue, it took me a moment to connect the dots. And I asked, "But do you mean like our tongue, a person's tongue?" And she said, "Yes, like an animal's tongue." And that was the last time I ever ate meat. I don't think I actually ate that piece of tongue, but I announced that evening that, I love animals. Everything came into focus in terms of the meat I had been eating, the chicken and, meat pies at school and sausage rolls and all these things were all animals. And I was shocked and outraged that we were eating animals because I love animals. I think a lot of kids go through this process. It wasn't something unique to me, but my family was supportive. Nobody else was vegetarian in the family or vegan. I mean, veganism wasn't even known really at that time when was that? 1981, I think. 1981. So I made an announcement that I didn't want to eat meat anymore, and my grandmother would cook me, special meals every night. And I imagine they thought it was just the stage I'd grow out of, but I didn't. And then when several years later, I was walking with my dad, and we passed by. At that time, animal groups would put up, tables with brochures and leaflets and petitions on clipboards to sign. And I walked past one of these tables of Animal Liberation New South Wales and, got exposed to the whole horror behind factory farming and industrialized animal agriculture. And I signed up to their magazine, became a member. And I started getting their magazines, I think it was once a month maybe. From that moment onwards, I knew that I wanted to dedicate my life to helping animals. And I remember lying on my bedroom floor with my dog Bronnie, and I was, had the magazine open in front of me, and there was just like a really traumatic kind of spread of visuals from an abattoir of people killing pigs, or it was a kind of a cruelty expose of what they were doing before the slaughter. And I said to Bronnie, that I am going to be dedicated to saving her kind. And I wrote like a letter to Animal Liberation that they then published a couple editions later, saying that, I'm 11, I think I was 11 or so at the time, I'm 11 and I can't believe what people do to animals, and I'm going to try and make a difference when I'm older. So, I was one of those kids, one of the crazy animal loving kids. My cat might appear in a minute in the frame.
It's fine. We love cats. There's no problem. It's wonderful that you made that connection. And something we were just talking about.
I think it was this morning.
It might have been this morning. We were saying, how people compartmentalize and out of sight, out of mind kind of thing with the whole meat thing. They don't associate with not only what, but who their meat is when they eat it. But things like tongue or other kinds of animal organs that are,
considered offal.
Yeah. You can't get away from what that is, and I think there are so many people that don't eat things like heart, liver, and all these awful parts of animals which also get consumed, but there's no hiding what they are, and that we have them as well, just as much as the animals do. So you can't package that up nicely any other way and pretend it's something that it's not.
Yeah.
Well, it breaks through that cognitive kind of barrier or the compartmentalization that we do for food animals, pets, wild animals, pests. We compartmentalize very effectively. And sometimes when something breaks through, it's, it can shock us and cause us to think differently.
When you've got mincemeat or whatever, to be honest, it could be anything in there. You're not entirely sure. Whereas, tongue, it's a tongue. And, it's quite funny meeting so many people and they're saying, oh, well, we honor the animal by eating every part. But so many of them that I know, they won't eat offal. I think it's because there's that awful connection there. So, it's so wonderful to hear your story and making that connection so young. And having been introduced to animal rights and then becoming an activist, which we love, at a young age, I would love to hear a little bit about what activism looked like in pre-internet Australia when you first kicked off.
Yeah, wow. It's hard to even imagine, life before the internet, let alone mobile phones or social media. But there was no internet. And things happened, in print or in person. So activism looked like, subscribing to a newsletter such as the Animal Liberation one, but there are others, I'm sure. And then there were sections in the newsletter which talked about protests that were happening. This date, meet at the bus stop here, and then a landline you could call. So that's what we did. And I went to, quite a number of protests back in the 80s. My friend and I went out. We actually skipped school. Don't do this, kids, but we skipped school and went off to the protests against duck hunting out in West Wyalong, which was, at that time felt like forever away from where we lived in Western New South Wales. And we spent a few days out there. That was Laurie Levy, who's still going strong and doing amazing work against duck hunting. And that was an amazing experience. I mean, difficult, challenging. We went out in canoes and the hunters were shooting around us, and we would be looking out for birds that were injured and, drop into the water and go and rescue them. And I remember, us taking one duck onto the boat, and, it had blood coming out of its beak, and, it was just like a very, very sad experience. Never sure if I should say this part of the story, but there was one duck hunter who was, because I think we were 17 at the time, or 16 maybe. There was a very cute duck hunter who started talking to us. And I think it's like an important component because it humanizes the other side, because you go into it and you're like, they're the enemy and we're the saviors. And that experience also helped me to understand. I mean, it sounds a bit silly to say, but understand that these are people on the other side with their own worldviews and their own experiences, and they're not evil necessarily. They just have a different perception of the world and our place in it. So, or perhaps they're just following their cultural tradition and their fathers and their grandfathers, traditions of what they like to do. So. So did the duck hunting protest. There was a fur protest in the city, I remember, through the CBD. My friend and I went to the Opera House to opening night at one of the fancy opera, opera performances, and everybody was there in their, beautiful clothes. And we pre-made little stickers saying "fur is murder," and we were sneaking around and putting them on the backs of women wearing fur coats. Yeah, I was a teenager.
I love that. That's great. That's great.
But no, it was very active, and there was a lot of tabling and leafleting and things like that.
Very hands-on. I guess you had to be, didn't you then? There was no other way. And that was incredibly brave. I mean, duck hunting is a big part of the culture here in New Zealand as well. I think we have 6 weeks of it or something starting very soon in May of every year. And it's a heartbreaking time. And I would not want to be out there with all those hunters trying to go in there and rescue the ducks. That was incredibly brave what you did. And very, very valuable as well. So.
You made a great point as well about, the humanization of, they're not necessarily the enemy. Because I know many hunters myself, who, their kids get dragged along to it and they don't necessarily enjoy it. But it's because what dad and granddad do, they go shoot ducks, and the kid gets dragged along, and that's what is conditioned into them, that this is okay to do, And there's many who don't like it, who still, they go along because that's what their family does. But once they actually start seeing what happens, especially with duck hunting, there's so many that are shot, which are never retrieved. And so they are just purely killed for the sake of killing. And it's such a sad thing. And I hope that there's plenty more protests out here. I'd love to see the vegan mags, actually, to be honest, taking a bit more of that old school approach and getting some more of these protest words out there, eh?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
In partnership with your father, Brian, together you founded the non-profit organisation Voiceless in 2004, one of Australia's leading, influential and cutting-edge animal protections groups. Voiceless represents animals in a court of law and incorporates school learning with a large focus on youth and education, debating, and my favourite, critical thinking. The organisation and its teachings play an invaluable role in shaping our future politicians, CEOs and creatives like us, to name a few. What was it that spurred the creation of Voiceless and honed your focus on that legislative change for the animals?
Yeah, going back, so this is 2002. I was working in the environmental protection movement because there weren't really jobs in the animal protection movement at that time. Also, I'm passionate about environmental protection as its own cause, of course. But I remembered my pledge to my dog Bronnie, and I was always looking for opportunities to do something for animals. My dad had just sold his financial management companies and was a little bit at a crossroads. So I, in a stroke of genius, if I might say so myself, I managed to convince him to come to Los Angeles with me to a 5-day animal rights conference. He was always an animal lover, and he actually went vegetarian about 5 years after I did. But he wasn't involved. He didn't really know, about the issues in detail. And so we went to this. It was 5 full intensive days in a hotel near the airport in LA. And it happened that it was just like an amazing, remarkable conference. There was, all the leaders of the animal rights movement were there. Peter Singer, Karen Davis from the United Poultry Concerns, Carol Adams, I think, was there. We saw an early edit of the film Earthlings, and just heard, like got a comprehensive analysis and assessment of the animal rights movement, both in the US and internationally. And at the end of that, he was very traumatized, and he said, look, we got to do something. And I was like, great. So we decided to start our own organization. And he came from this kind of business corporate world and had, very different ways of thinking and doing things versus me, who'd always been really in the nonprofit world. so we started Voiceless with a vision to be very mainstream, very inclusive and embracive, because animal groups at the time were seen as very extremist and radical and weren't taken seriously. There was really no media coverage of animal issues at all. It just had a very negative reputation. So we wanted to bring in, people who were in all different kinds of areas and industries, to show that this concern is a concern that all Australians share and all Australians have and should have. So we started with a broad grants program to support the animal movement to grow and flourish, and strengthen other activists and other advocates. And our focus was, quite strategically on factory farming, because we felt, or one of the things we really learned at that conference is, the extent and, the shocking numbers of farmed animals who, are suffering. So we felt that, can help more animals, gives us the biggest bang for our buck, is the most strategic approach. So law and education my father was always passionate about the law side, and I was always passionate about the education side, although I think law is extremely important area to be working in. But from the beginning, we invested time into both those areas, and we hired the first ever animal lawyer in Australia, and our approach was to always try to capacity build and promote the growth. So it's not just us out there campaigning and saying things, but we're just like constantly bringing in more and more people to grow and strengthen the movement, including the animal law movement, which just didn't exist there yet, but had gotten off to a good start in the US. So we were following that model. And we saw some really good progress in those areas. And especially you look today at the animal movement, and it's just, so much bigger and stronger and more mainstream than it was. So I think, not that we're taking all the credit for that, but I think that approach was a sound approach looking back, because you need an army. If this is like a war against animals, we need the resistance army to go in and create peace for animals. So we just need more people who are educated, in the issues, who have the tools, have the expertise to be, fighting and disrupting the current systems.
That's fantastic.
Love that, yeah.
And it's a great example of how us coming together in a couple of ways is so fantastic. Having that conference, in the first place, got that all ticking, but then having you and your father, those different sides of the coin, really, I suppose, in the mindset, come together, making something unique and
such
really
a formidable team.
Yeah, and it really just one thing that is very crucial for us at Vegan FDA here is about collaboration, and that's at the core of all of what we do. And it's having those folks who have the different talents to you and coming together and using it as a combined force. And we need to build that army, and we especially need strategists like yourself, who can help to direct that into the correct places. And it's we absolutely love what you're doing with it. But before Voiceless, the only groups in Australia which were engaging with school students about animals were organizations such as dairy, egg, and pork corporations, which are, of course, pro-industry. Not to mention the sponsors of many schools in low socioeconomic meal programs. Voiceless has been able to get another perspective in front of students and let them do their own research, which is fantastic. I'd love to know, how challenging was it to get Voiceless off the ground in a country like Australia, where, much like New Zealand, people are deeply conditioned to view animals as nothing more than essentially a food source or commodities?
Yeah, it is a very challenging country, as I'm sure New Zealand is. And this slowly dawned on us over the years, as we compared Australia with other places. And now, for the last few years, we've had this animal cruelty index, that we have on our website, which ranks countries according to, animal law and policy and animal consumption. And sorry, that's my cat wanting to have a say. And Australia is the worst. Australia and the US are the worst countries for animals in terms of the top 50 biggest animal production countries globally. So it's no surprise, really, that it's a challenging space to work in. And, meat and dairy and animal products form the backbone of the Australian economy. So as soon as you are criticizing or, inspiring critical thinking in that area, there's an immediate pushback. Also, farmers, the idea of farming is extremely romanticized in Australia, even though in many areas, such as, the pork production, pig farming isn't a romantic farming experience. It's controlled by, often multinationals and foreign interests and, massive companies. But still, the image of farming and so on is very precious to Australians. So we realized we have to tread very carefully. We started off at the beginning, actually, with, in terms of education, with an animal club model that we were promoting in primary schools. And it was all about just kindness and learning about animals and so on. But we already felt the kind of kickback very early on. A couple of teachers got into trouble with their principals because parents had complained that we had some kind of message. It actually ended up on the front cover of some local newspapers, and we had legal letters going both back and forth. And we actually got an apology out of one of the politicians in the local area who had made a statement about Voiceless that wasn't true, and so on. But it was interesting, but it wasn't necessarily interesting in a negative way, because we saw it as we must be doing something right. We're making people uncomfortable, and to create change, people have to get uncomfortable, and it's threatening to some people. But having said that, we were always very respectful with our own messaging. We never shamed or blamed or, pointed fingers at anybody. We just focused on, the facts, the science, the sentience, and so on. And slowly over the years, I think people have come to understand this is a very legitimate and an important issue. And there's nothing, you can't really argue with the facts on the ground that animals are experiencing X, Y, and Z, cruelty and mutilations and suffering. So it's just a slow process. But I think there are cracks forming in the system and things changing. Yeah.
Definitely. Thanks to organizations like you and the wonderful work that you and your dad Brian have been doing all these years. And Voiceless is an educational resource which leads the way into all kinds of non-preachy open discussions on important issues which directly do affect young people in their future, not to mention the non-human species they're of course learning about. And I really love that very inclusive approach that you have, a very welcoming approach. And it's so wonderful to see a voice like this for the animals in schools. I remember coming home from school in the UK one day. I was a fellow 80s youngster in 1986 and clutching a leaflet from Juliet Gallatley from UK charity Viva. It was her very first Scream campaign, and I was telling my parents, fervently I was now vegetarian. As you can imagine, it went down like a lead balloon. But you've mentioned the challenges that you had in those early days, getting the organization off the ground. How is this kind of teaching received these days? Do you get much in the way of resistance from the teachers or from parents, in daring to teach their young people that there is actually another way to live and different things to eat and to question their years of conditioning?
Yeah, it's the education system in Australia is not as centralized as one would imagine. So our approach, I mean, there's not one gatekeeper or one decision maker saying if something is allowed or not allowed. Basically, teachers have the ability, as long as they're sticking to their curriculum and following the kind of fundamental rules of going and finding, resources and information and delivering, their classes in whichever way that they want to. So our approach was, if we look at the population as a whole and say, I don't know, let's make a guesstimate that 20% of people really care about animals and really believe this is an important issue, or even 10% being pessimistic, that would be reflected in the teacher community. So there's a lot, thousands and thousands of teachers out there who are personally interested in animals and who want to be able to talk about these issues in the classroom. But as you mentioned before, there's really no resources except industry resources. And there's a lot of industry resources. So our goal initially was to enable and empower these teachers who are already on board in terms of values with having like professional, accurate, fact-checked, engaging materials that they can use in the classroom that then link to a new, many, many different curriculum. So they're ticking off their curriculum requirements. They're making their work easier because we're supplying them with everything they need, and they can go ahead and deliver, classes on some of these really important issues. So I think that was a good strategy, and our teacher database slowly built up, and we got good feedback from teachers, and we got a great platform called Education Perfect, which thousands of schools use to host our materials there as well and promote our materials. We did make a decision early on not to address food as such, because that is a very highly political issue in schools, and I don't think they generally do a lot of food, as in like, because it's a more of a personal decision. It's not really connected to the curriculum as far as I know. So, and also just because we didn't want to get that extra kickback about we're trying to make kids vegan, which makes parents very stressed out. We focused really on sentience and on critical thinking around issues. For example, we did a module on the live export issue and looked at, all different sides of, the argument and the issue and the, science and the ethics and so on. But we keep it really as a critical thinking and debate and discussion exercise. Because the information speaks for itself. And if you are not coming to people, I think generally, if you don't come to people with, this is how it is, this is what you need to think, this is the right way and the moral way, and you just pose questions, it's a bit of a no-brainer in terms of, I think for most people, because if you look at the ethics around the live export industry, it's tricky for people to argue that it's sound. So allowing the students to think for themselves and look at all sides of the argument and come to their own conclusions was our strategy, and I think it's a good one that other organizations could use, and is because this area is starting to grow now. It's called Humane Education more broadly. We were using the term animal protection education, but it's really under the umbrella of Humane Education, which is a really growing international area for students.
Well, that's fantastic. I really love the point of making sure that it ticks off those sort of curriculum sort of points, because there's a lot of fantastic organizations out there who are putting out this information, but by you actually tailoring it to fit that curriculum, it's a fantastic idea, and I think it's
so well thought out. Must have taken an incredible amount of work as well.
Yeah, it was quite work intensive, much more than we had imagined. We had an excellent educator on our team who came from who was 11 years as a teacher, an English teacher, and she coming from the point of view of a teacher, she knew what teachers wanted and needed. I mean, teachers are busy, they're time poor, they're really swamped. So you just, need to, I guess, respect that they don't have the time to go out and be creating some, some like new lessons that don't connect to anything that they're supposed to do, or maybe even doing, lunchtime groups or, afternoon groups. So coming from the educator's point of view, I think was a good angle. And we would kind of tailor and deliver materials straight to our teacher database, which is just like these, making their life easy was the purpose. But assuming that this is an area that they wanted to teach already. I think if we can get teachers who are already interested in these issues all teaching it, then that'll have a trickle-down effect. And it'll start becoming more normalized.
Absolutely. Imagine how many teachers you will enlighten just as much as the students, I'm sure.
Yeah, and then that whole that ripple effect as well, and how many students from the teachers and such and their friends and their families, and then we'll write an angry letter because you turned my my kids vegan. But another thing as well, I just want to pick up on as well is that it reminds me very much of the Socratic method that I know a lot of street outreach activists will be aware of, and that part of providing the information and then with the debate system, getting them to question it themselves. And for myself recently, I've been getting into plenty of online arguments and using the very same method.
From that, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm still championing my victories over that. But, it's great to see that as well, even in an educational platform, and just how powerful it can be just getting people to question that for themselves.
I think, what we understand more and more, especially in the social media realm, is people don't respond well to being shamed or told that they're horrible people and everything they've thought until now is wrong. Like, it might be true, but it's not going to convince anybody to change. You have to engage them and give them time. Also, it's a process. I mean, everybody goes through, often a really long process of, you hear a little bit of information here, you're like, oh, that makes me think. A year later, 3 years later, 10 years later, and then you're at a point where you're like, okay, I think I can make some change now. I understand what's happening. But it's not necessarily an overnight situation. And it's probably not going to be one person who does the trick and convinces you that everything you've thought of until now has been wrong.
Yeah, for sure. It is a process, and like for 99.9% of us, most of us weren't born vegan, and we all went through that process ourselves. For anybody who knows my backstory, I was dead sworn against it. I told, because Jackie went 5 days before I did, and I said, I love you, I will support you, but there's no way in hell am I ever going vegan. And then 5 days later, well, who's muggins? Me.
Here we are.
Here we are.
Now you're rendering your victim speeches for your Socratic debate.
Yeah, so there's definitely a process to it, and I feel like asking those sorts of questions, getting them to think for themselves, is one way to help water that seed, as people like to refer to it, and pushes that forward. But another avenue of education that Voiceless works tirelessly to advocate in and grow is teaching of animal law. Sadly, animals in law are still all too often considered property, valueless and worthless outside of their economic value. When Voiceless first started, there was just one university teaching animal law. Today, there are at least 14, and that number continues to grow. Awesome. I feel we can draw comparisons here, though, with our counterparts in the health-focused, plant-based movement, with the likes of Dr. Michael Clapper trying to get into med schools and educate doctors about nutrition before the pharmaceutical companies get in there and indoctrinate them into staying with the current systems where, well, patients are customers and they prolong suffering for industry profit at the end of the day. With animal agriculture representatives often in charge of legislation and that benefits their industry, and also in charge of the government bodies that are supposed to be protecting the animals from exploitation, do you feel your work here in teaching future lawmakers is a similar sort of race to get them educated in the true value of animals before they're sold into a system that exploits them for profit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. There's another parallel that I always think of with the environmental movement, in that environmental law was something that nobody had ever heard of until I would say 15, 20 years ago, maybe, when it started to grow. And animal law is a tricky area because it's so cross, I guess, disciplinary in terms of law. And, lawyers usually like focus on one particular area, like property law or criminal law, or, a certain area, and animal law cuts across all of those because animals are property. But then, if you're talking about activists who are going in and taking footage, and then there's the Ag-Gag laws, and that's, going into criminal law or all different areas. So I think we recognize that it's kind of a complex and challenging area of law to start building up. And it's really important to get young lawyers across all these different issues. And so it's the power of youth on the one hand. It's like when you engage people in university or at schools, you're helping to form their future selves. And these young lawyers are going to be out in the workplace, working at corporate law firms or working in government, and they're now going to be equipped with this really comprehensive understanding of the failures of the law to protect animals, which is really what it is. So it's not really animal law. It's kind of like how the law needs to be reformed to actually protect animals, even in the most basic of capacities, because at the moment, farmed animals get pretty much zero protection under the law. They're exempt from all the animal cruelty, legislations. So our strategy was really to I guess, like we were trying to do with the movement, to try and build up this, growing population of animal lawyers who will then be out in the world and, pushing back possibly, be it government or corporate, or using their skills to be pushing forward law reforms for animals. And it's been really like our most successful area of Voiceless's work. I mean, lawyers especially young lawyers, just love this area. Often people go into law full of kind of idealism and wanting to do something good, that they have a bit of a bad rep at the end. But, they're often like really passionate people who are interested in social change and social justice. And they love the area of animal law. And so it's just been exploding, really. So universities are all taking it up, and law firms are springing up that are focusing on animal law or dedicating whole, areas to a pro bono, support for animal organizations. I mean, Voiceless, at some point we had too many law firms offering to support us for free. We had to turn some down. So it's been really heartening to see this area. And, lawyers, for good or for bad, are often kind of put on a bit of a pedestal in our society. They're seen as kind of these very educated and, empowered people. And so back to my very early point of trying to mainstream the movement, once you get also like a army of lawyers involved in fighting for animals, it really disrupts this kind of view or this stereotype that animal rights or animal protection is for the hippies, extremists, radicals, like bludgers, because they're all, there in their corporate suits and ties and, looking very serious and very articulate. And so I think it's done a wonderful thing for the movement, having this growth in animal law.
Oh, that's fantastic. It seems like it'd be such an exciting side of it as well, because it's not just a case of dictating these laws which have already been set in place. It's, so much change is needed there, and you can see how these laws aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing once you have the animals in perspective. So it gets me excited. Although I've never been excited about law really beforehand, and it gets me excited thinking about, this is an area where there's change that can be made, and I don't know, I'm not one for like sticking to the rules too much, and like it just seems so much more going on there. And
I'm thinking the same. I can't argue my way out of a paper bag, but for the animals, I would do that no matter what.
That paper bag's got to change in that case. Not to plastic though, something better. But and also just as you're saying, it legitimizes our radical rabble, as it were.
And also protects us, because one of the really frightening global phenomena that's been happening are these Ag-Gag laws, which have basically been criminalizing activists from going in and taking pictures inside farms, which is basically the only way, as we know, that you can get any evidence of breaches of cruelty or cruelty. So in the US in particular, but it's been starting in Australia, and it's so to prevent that from happening, we need our lawyers, our animal lawyers, to be protecting, animals' rights and our rights to be able to access, I guess, it's like a public interest. I mean, it's considered like, as we said, animals are property. So it's considered like you're trespassing into someone's land to interfere with their property. But these are animals. They're not property. They're living, feeling beings, and they shouldn't belong to anybody. And if there's something happening, I think it's almost like, sorry, this is a bit of a side note, but, if we've got our children in daycares or kindergartens saying parents aren't allowed in to see because the children are the, daycare's property, and nobody can know what's happening behind those closed doors. So that's what's happening in animal industries. It's closed doors, nobody can access, there's no transparency, no freedom of information. So it's concerning.
Very true.
And for followers of the series, we've actually got another guest coming on, Jake Conroy, and he was tried as a domestic terrorist in the US for being part of liberation campaigns. And it's this year with Activism, we're going to be going into a lot more of these cases where it's just when you go into his case, it just seems ridiculous, the fact that he could be tried for what he was doing, which was just helping animals. And it's a very sort of scary thing what they're sort of trying to build. But I suppose like the lawyers now are our shield, whilst we have our other activists who might be the sword of the movement. They're the shield who's blocking those blows. So I'm excited about law now. I didn't think that was going to happen today, but I'm getting excited. But it's so fantastic to learn about that. But in using long-term strategies like this in teaching, we often won't see the effects of this education until later down the line. While shock tactics, fast action campaigns, direct actions, they're all common tactics of the movement, which show very quick results often. I'm interested to know why it is that Voiceless opt for the long haul approach as compared to single issue campaigns.
Yeah, it was always I guess my dad and I, always quite philosophical and interested in the ethical underpinnings of the movement and what we were really trying to achieve. And I think it helped that we were in a kind of a privileged place, that we had mostly our own funding. So I think that sometimes organizations, you want to keep your donors pleased, and you want to show quick, small results, which is just the nature of being in the nonprofit world and fundraising. So I think we had a little bit more scope to not be kind of showing those fast results, but just working on the building, on the capacity building, the relationships, building coalitions and questioning some of the deeper issues. And we shied away. We did several times get into more single issue campaigns, but I never felt personally totally comfortable with it, because even if those campaigns are won, the underlying issue still exists. I think, for example, of horse racing, and those campaigns, and Voiceless supported, projects to ban whips for horses. And that's quite a good example of, the whips are really just the symbol, the symbol of the problem. I mean, the problem is that we think it's ethically okay to be putting animals in a situation, taking them out of their natural behaviors and their family groups and keeping them contained and restrained and making them race so we can have a drink and make some money. I mean, the whole concept of horse racing is quite, mind-blowing when you really think of it. It's so that's an example of the work that we were trying to do more, looking at those underlying issues, and building up the community of people who were going to be addressing them. There's been a lot of great growth in the movement and obviously in veganism, but the actual situation on the ground for animals themselves in the factory farms or, in the industries has not improved a huge amount, which has been quite a bitter pill to swallow for me personally. But I also know for a lot of advocates, when you're looking back over, 20 years or 25 years of work, and we're talking about the same things. And I think it's because when you're doing the single issue campaigns and dealing with those more symptomatic expressions of the problem, you're dealing with the structures and the institutions that are already designed to work against animals and already, that have a culture and a system that is very difficult to change. So I think it's, digging down into the underlying values, our culture, young people, and bringing up a new generation that are seeing the world in a different way and in a more equitable, just way. So I hope that the youth of today, we say who Voiceless, we're investing in the youth of today to be our future change makers. I think young people really are one of the big solutions and a really important area to invest in for advocacy.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're our best bet, aren't they, at the end of the day? And it's so great that you guys are recognizing this and just putting so much of your, everything, your years of dedication into it. So we love what you're doing, and it's so great. I hope many other people are inspired watching and hearing all about your work. And at Vegan FTA, we know all too well how, despite our best intentions and all the best laid plans in the world, life has a habit of throwing you a huge curveball now and again. We also understand the feeling of despair and hopelessness that can really descend when these render us unable to participate in the kind of activism that we strive to achieve. As a devoted mother of 3, which you are, on top of everything else that you do, you have spoken before now of the incredibly tough challenges that you've faced raising your beautiful twin boys who were born with a rare genetic condition. Understandably, this led you to take a step back from Voiceless and the movement in general for some time. I still can't believe everything that you do. It's really, truly is amazing. And I think of activists, we are naturally hard on ourselves. We expect ourselves to be superhuman for the animals and everybody else. And I found it so valuable coming from someone like yourself who has achieved so much to hear that, it's actually okay. Sometimes we actually do have to take time out or away from the movement, but we can and we will get back to it. I know, I remember hearing that you told yourself this very thing. Are you able to share a little with us about that time?
Yeah, sure. It was, a really tough time. As you mentioned, I had my daughter Jasmine, and then I had twin boys a couple years later. And it slowly kind of unfolded that they had disabilities, and they're teenagers today. And they're severely disabled. They're in wheelchairs, and they don't speak verbally. They speak through computers, and they go to special needs school, and we have a whole raft of therapies and equipment, and it's a whole different world that I guess I was, plunged into the world of disability. And it was, tough times. I ended up taking time off Voiceless, which was really hard to do. But I felt like I had no choice, and ended up writing a memoir about my whole journey with Dov and Lev. They're 16 today and wonderful, beautiful kids. And I've learned how to, juggle life better and return to my passion of animals. I kind of came back into Voiceless around, I don't know, eight years ago or so. But yeah, during that time, it was tough because I really thought that I would have to give up all my passion for advocacy and all my work. And I didn't know how I would go back to Voiceless, and I didn't know how I would find time to do anything. I thought I would be a full-time carer. And I even thought I should retrain as a speech therapist or as a physiotherapist. And I started looking at different university degrees and so on. But it was a long journey and a process. And thankfully, slowly we got the support that we needed. And I was able to dip my toe back into the world of advocacy and also writing. When I wrote my memoir, funnily enough, I realized how much I love to write. Or I remembered how much I love to write, and that led me on to my Animal Allies series. So I kind of started the first book in that series, just as I was finishing up my memoir, because I just didn't want to stop writing. It was such a nourishing thing for me. So it, funnily enough, even though at the time I was very, depressed and sad that I didn't think that I could come back to the animal protection world. Funnily enough, it ended up taking me in a, bit of a different direction, using writing as a way to be an advocate, and, coming back to Voiceless with probably quite a different perspective. And life works in funny ways, and you just never know. Like, you just have to go with the flow and not be too hard on yourself. And I wish I was a bit less hard on myself at the time, because I felt so guilty, and like I was really betraying and letting down the animals that I had promised to spend my life working to protect. But I think when you have a passion and it's really like fundamental to your identity and your sense of yourself in the world, like, you'll find a way to come back to it. It might not be in a way that you expect, and it might be in smaller ways, but there'll always be a way to come back to it. But we have to give ourselves time and just treat ourselves with the love and kindness that we want to treat others with, which is sometimes hard. Because it's a traumatic area we're all in, this animal, rights, advocacy, activism. You're dealing with like really intense, very upsetting material, and your response is like, you just want to help and you just want to stop the animals from suffering, and you feel like a big responsibility. So navigating all of that and learning how to stay in it for the long haul and being sustainable and caring for yourself is so important. I think you end up giving much more in the long term if you take those moments to care for yourself, or take breaks if you need to go off and do something that's important otherwise.
Yeah, I love that. Definitely. And, I'm a great believer that everything happens for a reason, even if we don't know what on earth that reason is at the time.
So true. Yeah.
It's fantastic that you're able to get that support and, get back to this, because we're so grateful to have you still doing what you're doing now. And you bring something to this movement that is wonderful. And I'm sure all of our viewers who've been watching this so far will already see that with all that other work. We haven't really even talked about the books and such yet, because they are also wonderful. And
Thank you
having
so
found, we really mean it, and we're so glad that you found your calling during this time. And I don't wish anybody to find their calling as well in such hard times either, but if they find their calling, that's fantastic. But, you got to do what you can do, however that is, and many of us, we ourselves have our own difficulties in different ways. And in your case, with the writing, it sounded like it was a very cathartic thing. and something that really helped you through that time. And so initially, with it being a healing tool, I see now how it's become such a powerful form of creative activism. And as a prolific author, it's fantastic that you get these books out there. But whether it be written, visual, audio-based, would you agree that we need to encourage and sort of foster among our fellow activists to engage in that form of cathartic creativity in their activities as well for mental health, but also just to empower our advocacy?
Yeah, 100%. And it took me a long time to come to this understanding, because I think at the beginning, for many years, I was, I thought of the traditional activism or advocacy work as being the only way or the best way. And I think, I come to understand for myself, but I'm sure it's, for most other people, that you need to also have that self-awareness of what you can bring to the table in a way that is like, that's not going to totally sap you of all energy and make you exhausted and, be so draining that you're going to burn out, because burnout is a major issue in this movement. So I think we all have to be very mindful of keeping that nourishing aspect. And even if it doesn't, because I've always been about, let's be strategy. And even if it doesn't seem like something strategic at the time, if you start writing a book for teenagers like I did, I was like, I didn't know if anyone's going to publish this. I don't know if anybody will enjoy reading it, or if they do, it'll make a difference. So it doesn't seem like the most strategic use of my time, because it's a very long process writing a book. But I was like, whatever, I'm enjoying it. I'm putting my heart and soul into it, and I'm just going to do it anyway. And who knows, sometimes the most unexpected things end up being the most strategic, but we wouldn't have known it before. So I encourage people to just follow your heart, do something that's going to enable you to keep in the game long term. If that's doing it through music or art or film or, academic work or, protesting, or whatever floats your boat. Like part of that is just knowing yourself, knowing your character. People are so different. Some people get energized from being out in a big crowd and organizing and planning events. Like for me, that's the opposite. Like my energy comes from when I'm quiet and, contemplating and, putting my thoughts on paper or, or planning or strategizing. So part of it is, as we get older, we learn what fuels us and what sustains us, and also making sure that we take time for ourselves that is non-animal related, or maybe not even non-animal related. Like for me, that's just spending time with my animals, and that's not being strategic. I'm not helping any other animal if I'm hanging out with my dog, but it nourishes me, and then I can go out and continue my work.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
that's what I love about creative activism. It's both therapeutic and empowering at the same time. I started off writing as well for Vegan FTA, and I always figure, well, if something out of my vast ramble of things that I write encourages, just flips a switch for somebody, encourages one person, if it resonates with one person and teaches them something that they didn't know before, encourages someone to make a change, well, that's all been worthwhile, hasn't it? And I want to read all of your books. I need to read them all now. But let's talk about your most recent one first, Vegan Living, which is a simple and comprehensive guide to a cruelty-free, healthy, plant-based lifestyle. Now, I wish I had a copy of this in front of me right now, because everybody tells me it is the most beautiful book, but this is the guide. Look at that.
There we go.
Gorgeous. It's gorgeous. I've been hearing so much about how beautiful it is.
It's so beautiful the way it's been. Wait, I'm not angling it properly, but there's some beautiful illustrations. I ended up with a beautiful designer. So
that is wonderful. I'm going to get a copy of it as soon as I can. I'm just going to order the whole lot, and we'll get to that before the end of this interview. But it is the guide. I'm hearing everybody say this is the guide for the veg curious in how to go vegan, which is how hard is it to write a book like that? We know, where on earth do you start? But it answers all of the most common questions that people have about veganism. It dispels all of those health myths and the concerns, and includes lots of personal hacks and tips and tricks as well. It's the kind of book that, people like us really want to loan out to people, because it saves vegans from constantly having to answer all the same questions again and again. And there are so many facets of veganism that aren't so commonly talked about in your book, even by vegans. I'd love to know, what were the standout things that you learned when you were researching and compiling Vegan Living? What sort of things surprised you the most? I've heard some things about the section in particular on leather that you wrote, but for you as the author, what surprised you the most? What are some big takeaways?
It was a really lovely process, in particular because I decided early on to interview like a whole lot of vegans, because I thought, I don't want to just have my voice and my opinion. I want to like have it as a community and as a more of a collaborative feeling, and have lots of quotes and lots of profiles, and give a sense of like the scope of, there's so many different kinds of people who are vegan. It's not like one particular profile. So I interviewed I think about 150 vegans. I think one of the things that I found surprising from the interviews was how imperfect vegans are. Because you can get a feeling on social media in particular that there's like the vegan police. And if you're not like 110% perfect in every single thing, if you don't check every ingredient of every ingredient and have it certified and verified and checked, then you're going to get like kicked out of the vegan club and, thrown to the wayside. So one of the things that I was pleasantly surprised about, because I've always been clear that I'm not a perfect vegan. It's very difficult to be a perfect vegan in our world, in that there are animal products hidden in pretty much every part of life and society. But even if you try your utmost best, it's not a perfect situation. But a lot of people shared stories about, like if I'm in this situation, like I'm at dinner or like somewhere with my family, or a friend has cooked some beautiful meal, but they've forgotten that there's some egg in the cake or in the pasta, or that there's, I don't know, they put honey in something. They're like, out of respect for them, I'll just let it slide. Like I feel like people were expressing and telling the stories about how we live in a non-vegan world, right? And there's vegophobia. There's a lot of negativity and discrimination even, and stereotypes around vegans. And so as a vegan, you have to kind of like navigate and deal with society as a whole, and even your friends and family. And I think people were sharing stories about how they were trying to navigate that. And that sometimes meant, and it's okay to not be 100%, if you're 95%, that you're still doing a good job. You're still a vegan. I feel like we should be 95% vegan. That should be our, aspiration, because I feel like, and there's been some writing on this, and some people have crunched numbers on this. Like if we increase the vegan worldwide population from what it is today, which I don't think there's any, final figure on that. Let's say it's 1% or 3% of 100% strict vegans, and go to a 95% vegan, we could probably get much more easily to 10 or 20% of the population, because you can do that. It's much more accessible. So that was one of the surprising things that I found with all these interviews, is that people were a little bit softer on themselves than what it seems like on social media, and they're softer on each other, which is nice. The other thing was something interesting I learned about cheese and about the addictive nature of cheese, which made so much sense, because I don't know about you guys, but I can't count the number of times people have said to me like, oh, I could be vegan, but I love cheese. I just couldn't give up cheese. Well, there's like a biological, neurological reason for that. There's actually an addictive protein called casein in cheese that enables infants, animals, or humans to want to keep breastfeeding. So nature has designed, this addictive protein to keep the babies coming back and eating or drinking, so they continue to grow. And so that protein is what keeps us humans addicted to, animal milk, which I thought was a fascinating explanation. One more thing that I was surprised to see because I don't know that much about nutrition. I'd never really delved into the vegan nutrition world. Was how, another thing that you get feedback all the time is, oh, what about protein? What about iron? I'm going to be low on iron, or I'm not going to have enough protein. And protein and iron are really not issues in the vegan population. Like medically, there's just like no data showing that we're lacking either protein or iron. There is data around calcium, which I was surprised to find. So if we're going to be worried about anything, calcium should be what we think about. But we can get calcium through plant-based foods without any problem. But the whole kind of retort of protein and iron is just a bit of an urban myth.
Yeah, it's very much become the common joke thrown around, and we're even joking with our founder today. She's got some vultures that have been circling around the house lately, and I said, "Oh, it must be that protein deficiency. You see, they're waiting for you to drop, and it's I believe it's casomorphine. I believe is the full protein that's the one that links to your brain. As meant to be, I think." Heroin has the same effect. It's that addictive substance, and
I'd heard the reason. Well, I'd heard of what it was, but I didn't realize that was the reason behind it. That whole instinct to feed like that, which is really
makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Yeah, because if it tasted horrible, and you're not going to come back. Well, many species wouldn't thrive as they do. But I love how you brought up about the whole vegan police thing, and I'm sure I would have had my vegan card revoked for a few times where I've bought things not realizing, then I've given them away. Or, there's even been the case where I've eaten something and then realized, oh my God, this has got milk powder in it, despite they put milk powder in everything. Oh, they hide in so many horrible things. But, these things happen. I would much rather have 100. I'd even rather have 100 plant-based people than, one super perfect, ethical, shining light vegan, I'm not saying I don't want more vegans, but more the merrier. Let's get more people on board. Let's get that. If we're aiming for that tipping point, then we do need a lot more people on board. And for our audience as well, as you know, we love this. Get more activists too in that process, because that's 2 for 1 pretty much. So get active and just get out there and be part of this.
Going back to what we've been talking about throughout this interview, with the inspiring and educating that younger generation, you've also written a trilogy of young adult fiction, which you referred to before as the Animal Ally series. The series, which I definitely want to read as well, has a vegan protagonist and covers animal protection issues. What was the inspiration for writing young adult fiction in this largely sort of unexplored genre?
Yeah, I was just drawn to writing for teenagers. I think partly because as a teenager myself, or when I was younger, even as a kid, there just wasn't much out there. And there's still not a huge amount out there. It's growing a little bit. But, I never read a story where the protagonist was even vegetarian, or even there were vegetarian characters. There were stories that had animals in it, but not about a person's ethical relationship with the animal. And I always have loved books. I've been a bookworm since I was little. So I wanted to focus on young people, and I guess going back to the strategic side, strategically growing that area of literature. So young people who are interested in animals or love animals, can see themselves reflected in characters in a book. And we know how important that is, to see oneself reflected on TV and in films, and having that diversity and that, different types of people. Because if you don't see any reflection of yourself, you don't feel like you're seen or that you're valid as much. You feel weird. So getting young people, and I really do believe in the power of young people. I mean, I think young people, especially of this like young teenage age, so kind of 11 to like 15 or so, they often just have such idealism and passion and ability to kind of see outside the box, or to reject social conditioning. It's that rebellious stage. So you're like rejecting certain messages that you've been hearing your whole life, or you're rejecting your parents' worldview, or the way that they think about certain issues, and you're like out in the world finding your identity, looking for new ways to express yourself, a community of people who are like you, who you can connect with. So I wanted to reflect all of this in my books. It's honestly been such a lovely surprise. I think because I'm on Instagram and waste probably way too much time on Instagram. So some of my readers find me there and send me DMs with, lovely little messages about how they're enjoying my books, which, is the world to me. and the whole reason why I really wrote these in the first place, because I really did go into it. And like I said before, I mean, writing doesn't seem like a very strategic way to use your time if you're an activist or advocate. But, I went into it just for the journey and the process. And, from a very Zen point of view, it's just like, this is my expression. If it finds an audience, it finds an audience. And I really just need one person. If it makes a difference for one person, then, I can't ask for more than that. And I feel like, it has done that job. And it's my Sky has actually done quite well commercially. So it's been great, and I'd love to continue at some point. Yeah, it was really fun, like the most creative project I've ever done, inventing characters and inventing plot lines and dialogue, and it was good.
Oh, that's fantastic. See that, and like that's the thing, like you with the people you might reach with this, it may be an introverted teenager who, when they see activists out in the street, they may just make the beeline, straight away from them, not going to interact, not going to do that. But then if they happen to pick up this book and get into it, it's tapping into somebody who you may not get with any of these other more conventional forms. And it's great that you can have that creative release through it and have fun in doing this. And so, please, for anyone in our audience, if you have little passion projects, follow them, follow them for the sake of yourself. And then you never know what with art, who it's going to affect. You can put something out there and you never know the result until they hit you up on Instagram in your DMs and say what a wonderful time they had. But the protagonist, Sky, is a young teenager who relocates from the city to the country and is confronted by what she discovers. You've mentioned in previous interviews that you address the issues young vegans face, such as peer pressure, and lifting the veil on terms such as free range and humane. How do you share the truth of what's hidden in animal cruelty, such as factory farms, and in particular, in Sky's case, the truth of chickens who are raised for meat, without scaring the young folk off, not terrifying them between the pages,
Yeah, no, I was very mindful of that. I mean, I had been traumatized and terrified as myself when I was that age, like I described, reading the animal liberation magazines, which weren't appropriate content for an 11 or 12-year-old. So I was, very, very mindful that I didn't want to cause any trauma. But I didn't want to shy away from the truth either. So I was trying to juggle those two things. And I didn't, fiction isn't meant to be didactic. You're not like telling anybody what to think. You're creating a world and characters, and people are going along for the journey with those characters. So I didn't want to kind of go into like a preachy mode of like, this is wrong and this is so I even for the characters in the books who were, kind of like the anti-animal people, I tried to make them as human and as rounded and personable as possible, because of course they are, everybody is, in real life. Everybody has their nuances and complexities, and the world isn't divided into baddies and goodies. So I was mindful of that. And one of the techniques I used was the relationship that Skye, who's the main character, has with animals. So in the first book, and not to give any spoilers, but she has like a friendship with a chicken, and that it comes from a genuine place, and she learns about chickens, and Chirp, her her companion chicken, and that allowed me to bring things into it. She also kind of goes on this adventure where she stumbles on a farm and so on. So that's part of the kind of moving storyline. But since everything's through her eyes, she has her own experiences. So it's not about the information or telling people what to think. I was just allowing people to see what she was seeing as a character and experiencing her love for Chirp, like as a young woman. I'm trying to think of how else I avoided that. I mean, the second book is set in Alaska, and addresses kind of trophy hunting world. And that was really fun to write, because I kind of immersed myself in winter in Alaska, and there's a moose in the book, and different wildlife. And the third book is back in Australia, and it's more around social media and the kind of naming and shaming kind of culture that sometimes goes on. And it was almost like a reverse, like she encounters the whole vegan activist world, and she has to kind of find herself within that and work out what she feels right and wrong, and what where her boundaries are within the vegan world. So I thought that was also an interesting angle. So it's not only like the vegans are the goodies and everyone else is the baddies. It's just like people are complicated, and even in any environment, in any network, and especially online, we have to find our place and find our voice, and be ourselves and be true to ourselves. So it was fun and interesting, and very challenging to navigate all these tricky issues.
Definitely. Very rewarding that you've ended up with these 3 beautiful books. And I don't know, I've been listening to you talking, and my brain is turning, thinking, well, I know this young lady that needs to read that book, and I know this one that needs to read this book. And hopefully there are a lot of parents watching as well that will be inspired to go and check out your website, which we will be sure to share, and let you know where you can get these books from for your own young people in your lives. But thanks to successfully getting your Animal Ally series into schools, yay, ethical questions are now being discussed through Skye and Snow and the other characters in your books, which is so brilliant. How hard is it, though, to get this narrative into schools, especially in a time when, we're being encouraged now, again, to provide free milk like in the good old days, and advertising constantly pushing how young people, as you mentioned, need calcium for strong bones. How did you go about it?
Right from the beginning, I was really keen to have like a curriculum aligned component to the book. So I spoke with my publisher for the first book, Skye, and they wanted to go ahead and create that like school connection. And yeah, I was actually very surprised, to be honest. I think, there's schools are kind of like a complex, also like decentralized kind of situation, much more than we think. And often it's like the groups of subject teachers that can be more influential than anything else. So like English teachers. So my books fit into English. And so then, and then English teachers are just looking at it as a work of fiction and its appropriateness for their age, and if it, brings up interesting issues, and it almost is more accessible in a way, because it's a story at the end of the day, and so yeah, it was lovely to see. There was one picture of from a school that we received where all the kids were holding up the book, and I was like, yay. But you can, and I really do encourage advocates to think about education and schools as a really important area to be working in and focusing on, because there is not one gatekeeper. If you can access teachers, and teachers on Facebook groups, and teachers are at conferences, and teachers are parents at, possibly your kid's school and so on, you can have inways into schools, and libraries. The decision of the librarian what books to stock is their decision. There's no kind of complex bureaucracy around that. It is hard to actually get contacts and into schools. So that's the tricky thing. There's not like one database where you email every school in Australia. You have to kind of have your strategies for kind of accessing teachers and so on. But I think it's an important area, and it's really nice to see it growing slowly.
I absolutely love that. And
genius stroke, having that curriculum already in mind as well before you even start.
I was going to say, folks, once again, pick up on this point if you're doing anything educational, curriculum in mind, because that's just such a fantastic strategy. I've probably said fantastic about 100 times now through this interview, because it's just wonderful. I love it. I get that into your stuff, folks, when you're making it. So in a previous interview, you've described yourself as a goal-orientated person, which you inherited from your parents. What are your goals right now, or ultimately, as we've already touched on, there's many issues affecting Australia, as there's also many issues affecting many other countries. Do you have any plans to take Voiceless global?
Yeah, so my goals at the moment, I try not to be too goal-orientated, but I think it's just in my DNA or something. So I signed up to do a PhD last year. Wow. So I'm currently in my second year of doing a PhD through Sydney University, actually, through this really fascinating group of academics and students called the Multi-Species Justice Group. And they, kind of this combination of animal rights, environmental rights, human rights. So I've been in a state of deep learning and realizing how little I knew about anything, reading about philosophy and ethics and sociology and so on. So my original goal, actually, before I started the PhD, was to write a book about what causes people to have an aha moment that changes the way they see and consider animals. And when I started kind of researching into that, I realized this is such a big area. It's so complex and multidisciplinary, and people are very complex. There's not like one singular thing. So I've delved into a PhD with the question being what causes someone who has animal rights values, who is an animal person, so to speak, to have come to that moral framework or worldview, and looking at all the influences that they've had throughout their life, but also looking at their experiences with animals and how that might have influenced them. And then I hope to turn that into a book and share some of the findings. So that's one of my goals at the moment. And then with Voiceless, we're kind of transitioning into more of a strategic philanthropy space. So we're looking really to invest now with change makers and really inspiring projects and ideas that are going to kind of be disruptive and deal with more of those core long-term issues that we talked about like how can we change this very toxic human-animal relationship, and how can we move beyond this anthropocentric and arrogant human view of animals, the speciesism, into a different kind of thinking about animals as being different but equal and so on. So So those are the two big areas that I'm working on, and it's been really exciting because I've been doing such interesting reading and also listening to lectures and conferences and podcasts of real thought leaders in this space. So stay tuned. I hope to share my findings
Absolutely.
as soon as possible.
I'm very excited about both of those things. It's great. And, I said it before, I don't know how you do it all, but we are so lucky. The movement is so lucky to have you. And for anyone who hasn't heard of Voiceless before, or even if you had, but just sort of not checked it out, Voiceless website alone is a massive wealth of information for people of all ages and whatever stage you're at their pre-vegan or vegan journey. And we definitely encourage, everyone to go and have a look because there's so much to learn. Even before all this other great stuff that you're about to do as well. There are comprehensive teacher resources on there from all kinds of issues, from broiler chickens to fishes to live export. You've mentioned there's a great section on that, critical thinking and much, much more. There is a huge section on animal law, including, a lot of things that we don't think about, let alone know about, what animal law actually is, how and where you can study animal law, policy reforms, how to write law reform submissions, and just generally get involved in being a voice for the animals in the law system, which it looks like Gareth now wants to do.
I know where I'm heading after this.
It really is. It's a fantastic, and it's just so chock full of resources. What other kind of content and tools can our audience find at the website, which is voiceless.org.au?
Yes, thank you. We do have like a huge library of resources. I encourage people to check out the Voiceless Animal Cruelty Index, which is all on there. And you can look at there's 50 country profiles, looking at all different aspects of the way they treat and consider animals, and then comparing and contrasting them. So that's a fun tool. Well, not fun, but interesting. But I think we've got some great blogs on all different kinds of subjects, and just the fact sheets I think are really important because sometimes every fact sheet we've done has been so well researched and so referenced, and every single word is based in fact and truthful literature and evidence. And sometimes when you're just kind of out there Googling information, it's that care isn't always taken. So there's a lot of information online on Instagram and YouTube and so on. But as we know, we have to arm ourselves with like really the most expert information as possible. And so that's a good place to start, even looking through our reference lists and going from there. So I encourage everybody to check it out. And thank you so very much. This has been so nice. I really appreciate all the complimentary words as well.
It's so welcome. I
can say again, it's been fantastic. We've loved this whole thing, and it's one of the things that we really cherish about doing this series as well, is getting to learn from experts like yourself, learn so much more about the strategy, see how all of us, ourselves, our audience, can be getting better with their strategy for activism, so we can all be punching that bit harder, or we can be stopping those blows with the law degrees and the animal law, protecting the others, doing this fight. I didn't think I'd be getting excited about law. I am now. I'm gonna have to go to the website and see where I can study here in New Zealand. I don't know
where to get all that credible information as well for next time you argue with your Socratic method.
Yeah, I still don't know if they'll let a rough rebel like me into many of the law colleges, but we'll soon see. Like, I don't think.
Put on a nice shirt. I'm sure you'll be fine.
I might get a few steps in before they kick me out for something, but that will be a good laugh. And yes, please, for our audience watching this, please go check it out at voiceless.org.au, and also check out the rest of Ondine's amazing work, all of her books at ondinesherman.com. And just thank you so much for joining us today. I can't express it enough how much of a pleasure it's been to meet you and learn from you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so
for
much.
all that you've done.
And thank
And
you
we
guys
continue.
for all your work that you do and your amazing advocacy and creating the connections and collaborations. It's so important for everybody to be talking to each other and connected with each other. It's really going to help the movement and help the animals. So well done.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, hopefully this all helps as well with your research. Hopefully we're all learning a bit more about each other's aha moments. It's not just me listening to Jackie's old playlist and he listen to aha. It's a proper education here. And yeah, I hope everyone has enjoyed this as much as I have. Well, as much as I'm sure we both have.
I don't listen to aha.
The aha, I think, comes from Oprah, actually. It's not the most academic of references. Transformative moments is probably better.